Your slide deck just went over.
Okay. I had to close my door. Good morning, everyone. We're just opening up the webinar this morning, and as soon as we get a few more people in, I will go ahead and start the introduction. So we're just going to take a few seconds to wait till some folks get in. Okay, Rocky, it looks like that's pretty stable right there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm going to go ahead and start. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Spring Gardening Webinar Series presented by the Central Oregon Master Gardeners, Oregon State University, and our sponsors. This is a beautiful April Earth Day, so we are glad that you have taken time out of your busy schedules and lives to join us this morning. My name is Vicki Miner, and I am your host. Rocky Bassett is another Master Gardener who is also assisting this morning. Our presenter is Amy Jo Detweiler, who will talk about design tips on greenhouse size, materials, locations. And she'll also cover some tips related to heating, cooling, lighting, watering, and maintenance of greenhouses. The presentation is being recorded and will be available online for a short period of time following our session this morning. You'll get an email from us a few days after we're done with a link to the recording. But before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping matters. Your microphone is muted and your video is off. If you wish to ask a question, and we really encourage you to do that, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if you like a question that someone else asked, you can upvote it. You just have to click on the little thumbs up and that will move that question up. So Amy Jo Detweiler is our presenter this morning, and she is responsible for teaching and outreach in community and commercial horticulture in the high desert environment of Central Oregon. She works with homeowners and green industry professionals. She specializes in sustainable landscape practices, including water-wise gardening, fire-wise landscaping, and backyard food production. She's also responsible for training and managing an active group of master gardeners who volunteer across our Tri-County region. So at this point, I am going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn this over to Amy Jo. So Amy Jo, you still are muted. Your audio. So hang on, folks, while she finds her microphone.
Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see you and we can hear you, which is wonderful.
Okay, so welcome everyone. This morning we're going to talk about greenhouses in Central Oregon. As Vicki mentioned, we're going to cover the elements that are important to growing plants in a greenhouse. And so what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to go into detail about actually how to construct a greenhouse. What I'm going to talk about is the elements of constructing a greenhouse and the importance of those elements so that you can successfully use your greenhouse when all is said and done. So to start out, I just like to give the definition of what I'm referring to when I'm talking about a greenhouse, because there's a wide variety of definitions out there on what that is or what that looks like. Let me get, so this is going to advance for me. It seems to be, there we go. Okay. So technically speaking, a greenhouse is going to be anything that has clear, transparent coverings and has an actual artificial heat source coming to it. Now, you don't necessarily have to have an artificial heat source. You can have a passive greenhouse as well, and we'll go into more details on what that looks like. But I want to start out this morning just by getting a sense of, from those of you that are on the class here, who already has an existing greenhouse. And so we're going to pop up a poll right now so I can just kind of gauge the number of people that already have a greenhouse and those that are maybe. So go ahead and answer that first question for me and that second question for me. Well, you might as well answer all three of them at this point. Because I'm not sure you'll get the chance to go back. So go ahead and answer all three of those questions. The third one being if you already have a greenhouse, if you have some pest management issues.
So Amy Jo, we've got about 39 people in. So when it looks like we're pretty close, I'll end it. Okay, it's hanging pretty steady at 77% who have
Okay.
answered. So I'm going to go ahead and end it so we can get the results. So can you see that?
Yes. So, all right. So do you currently have a greenhouse right now? 10 of you are saying yes, 18 no's. So a little more than half. Are you planning to build one? 16 saying yes. 12 saying no. And then have you experienced any of the following pests? Let's
Aphids,
see.
very popular.
So, okay. For those of you that have a greenhouse, aphids, there's going to be the top one. Okay. So I just wanted to know which ones are the biggest challenge for folks here. So it looks like
Okay.
that one. All right.
I'm
All
going
right,
to stop
great.
sharing this then.
Okay, so let's go ahead and keep going. So other things that are normal components of a greenhouse would include, beyond the electricity, you'd have automatic ventilation potentially, artificial heating, cooling, and then what kind of separates a greenhouse from something like a high tunnel is that it's typically a permanent structure that can't be moved around once it's put in. Just to give you a ballpark figure, if you're looking for costs and you're considering putting one in, depending on the types of materials you use, the general kind of the median range for the cost for a greenhouse would be $20 to $25 per square foot, just to give you a sense of expense there. Versus something this would be considered a high tunnel. High tunnels are more flexible. They have the ability to move. They can also be very useful here in the high desert. They're going to be a more low cost type of structure to put up. Initially, you can see a much lower cost, but there's also, you're going to be replacing the potential coverings on that more frequently. And it may or may not be something that's workable for you. You can see here, just as a tip, if you decide to build a greenhouse structure that's going to have the polyethylene plastic, you want to make sure it's that 6 mil greenhouse grade plastic, and we'll talk more about that. Okay, so let's go into some of the details of the elements of a greenhouse. And everything I'm talking about here is all to get to the end result of us wanting to be able to successfully grow something, start seeds in our greenhouse here in the high desert. And this particular winter is a great example of why a greenhouse would be beneficial. We're having the longest winter as far as the temperatures keeping a steady cool. And I think it's only really next week that we're going to start to see some gradual warm up. So it'd be a really good year to have a greenhouse to get some things going and started. These are just some other items we're going to look at as elements of a greenhouse. Okay, first off, one of the biggest benefits of a greenhouse is you can get things started and you can exclude our favorite friends here that often can do damage. And so not only are they an actual barrier to deer or something like that, but they also provide that nice indoor environment. This is kind of a silly photo that was shared with me. And I feel like this is true in Bend or Redmond or here in Central Oregon. So greenhouses have some great value for us in getting things started. So things that you should be penciling out if you haven't put your greenhouse up yet is how are you going to use it? What can you afford to build and how are you going to heat it? And then you need to think about adequate venting. And one of the more common errors that individuals make is if they're building it from scratch and it's not a kit, ideally try and find something that's a little bit wider. And so sometimes the kits can be pretty small as far as the width of them goes. If you can go 8 foot or wider, you're going to have more elbow room to work within the greenhouse. If you can't afford a bigger greenhouse, you can always start with something like this cloche. We've got a publication online. And oh, by the way, I have a PDF of this entire presentation that'll get emailed to you at the end of the class. So you'll have all this information in front of you. You don't really necessarily need to take notes because you'll have every slide to reference when we're done with this. But here's a cloche that you can put up that is not near as costly if you're just trying to find some sort of place to start plants or to protect plants during the growing season. So one of the things to think about is where we are actually located on the map and globally where we're located. And if you're wanting to grow through the winter months, ideally a 10 foot by 12 foot size greenhouse is going to allow you, if it's designed correctly, it'll allow you to maximize the sun during the winter months. Anything smaller than that, it's not that you wouldn't be able to grow, but you can actually take full advantage of the sun if it's a little bit larger and you have a little bit wider girth on that exposure during the winter months when the sun sits really low on the horizon. The larger the greenhouse, the easier it is to maintain a constant temp, but it also will take a little bit longer to heat up and cool down. So if you're going to purchase one of these kit greenhouses, these are some of the things you'll want to look for in one of those kit greenhouses. Again, you want to look at the width of it and make sure you're going to have enough elbow room to move around in it successfully. Always be checking for adequate ventilation, and ventilation is going to be defined as actual doors, windows, roof coverings that are going to open and let hot air out. So it's not going to be circulating fans that you have moving the air around in the greenhouse. It's going to be actually an opening to the outside so that you can let that hot air out. And for example, on this slide, you can see the roof vent here, and then the door being open would also be considered ventilation. Sometimes the kits that are sold don't provide adequate ventilation for the size of the greenhouse that it's at. Another thing to check is potentially the warranties or the company. Make sure the company's been in business for a while in case you have to do replacement parts over time. It's easy for you to do that. So you're thinking about the size of the greenhouse, potentially how you're going to heat or cool it. If you're going to go bigger on the greenhouse, once you get past a certain size, you may need permits depending on what city or town you live in here in Central Oregon. And the materials used are all going to contribute to that cost initially. Other things to think about if you're having it shipped to you, what it's going to cost to ship potentially, and whether or not you want to do it yourself or hire a contractor. I know there are some local companies here in Central Oregon that are building greenhouses for individuals. So that's something you can check into too if you're interested in doing that. So selecting a site is going to be one of the most critical parts of putting up a greenhouse. You want to make sure that you're putting it on a level site, ideally. You want to make sure that you're going to be able to water in it and think about where that water is going to go as it drains off. And if it's level, then hopefully you're not going to have runoff contaminating any of the surrounding areas around where your greenhouse is. So there's just some variables to think about in site selection. Additionally, you want to think about water source. Where are you going to get your water from? If you're going to be using a garden hose, you just want to make sure it's convenient, you can access it easily. And also if you're going to be providing electricity to your greenhouse. One of the other most common mistakes that individuals make in putting up or designing greenhouse is not allowing enough space to add on or grow the greenhouse. So sometimes individuals will start small with their greenhouse and then they really have fun in there and wish, gosh, I wish it was a little bit bigger. And so be thoughtful in that too, in selecting a kit or in selecting a site so that potentially you could add on to it if you needed to down the road once you get going. And then there's always the question of aesthetics, and this is just personal preference. Some of you may want it to look aesthetically pleasing in the neighborhood, in the house, depending on where you live, versus perhaps you don't care about that. It's all just about functionality. And those are just some things to consider when selecting materials to build your greenhouse. Probably most important here is avoiding deep shade. And so make sure that you're maximizing the amount of sunlight that's going to fall in the greenhouse so that you can maximize the growth of the plants within. Try and avoid frost pockets or high winds, although you know the greenhouse will protect what's inside of it, but you want to make sure your greenhouse stays put or in place. You can use a sun locator if that's helpful, where you actually can go out and determine where the sun is during the winter months. During the summer months, you'll have, full access to sunshine as long as it's not shaded by structures or trees. But if you're planning to grow through the winter months, which some of you may be doing, that may be why you're putting a greenhouse up, then you want to look at where's the winter sunset, because it's going to be coming in at a much lower angle in your greenhouse. You want to make sure you're going to maximize that winter sun if you're growing in the greenhouse through the winter months. There's some real simple sun locators you can purchase or even make. And if you have questions about that, you can contact me and I can send you one. You can just make a handmade one. So just to be thinking about what that looks like, the angle of the greenhouse when you're building it, you want to think about how that winter sun's going to hit it and that angle of incidence. You can maximize it so that the sun coming in is going to provide the most amount of sunlight during those winter months. And so for a single span greenhouse, which is probably what most individuals would be doing, if you have the option, if you have the choice on how to orient your greenhouse, the way to maximize sunlight entering the greenhouse is to run the ridge line, which is going to be this top part up here. You want to run that ridge, depending on the shape of your greenhouse, from east to west, so that the southern exposure of the greenhouse, where you have the widest girth of glazing material, is exposed to the south. And so if you're able to do that, that's going to be the way to maximize sunlight. If you flip it around and you run your ridge line north to south, you're going to decrease the amount of sunlight by 25%. So really try to find that spot where you're able to run that ridge line east to west so that you have that full potential. There are lots of different types of greenhouses you can build, and whether or not it's a freestanding greenhouse or a lean-to, for example, that you're adding on to the side of your home, there's going to be pros and cons to all these different types of greenhouses. A lean-to, for example, that would be built on to the side of your house, you're going to probably have better control of keeping it heated because of the connection to the home versus a freestanding greenhouse. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, but I do have some resources available on the different types of greenhouses and actual plans and engineering. If you have an interest, you can contact me and come and take a look at those. But here are some examples of what some of these different types of greenhouses look like. So here's like an attached lean-to on these. You've got different shapes and sizes, and it depends on where you live here in Central Oregon, but you might want to consider that if you have more snowfall, less snowfall, because the other items to consider is snow load and make sure it can handle snow load, and then also wind. As far as the framing material goes, you can use wood or metal. Wood used to be the go-to. Now we're seeing mixes of aluminum framing or steel framing. So it just depends on what your budget can allow for. If you're going to use wood, make sure it's rot resistant wood, because you're going to have a lot of humidity and moisture inside that greenhouse. So things like cedar could potentially work. Also, depending on the size of your greenhouse and how big it is, you want to make sure if you're going a little bit longer than say 8 feet, you want to make sure that in between each of these structural components that you're going about 4 feet. Some of the pre-made kits that are sold out there have 6 feet between the structural supports for the greenhouse, but you want to make sure it's 4 feet here in the high desert because of the snow load. In particular, 6 foot will collapse, 4 feet will be strong enough to support. So make sure you're just going 4 feet between here and here to help with that snow load. You don't want to do smaller than that necessarily, because then you're going to start to really lose a lot of the potential glazing material and the amount of light transmission. So keep it to 4 feet if you have a choice and you're building from scratch, or try and find a kit that's 4 foot just to allow for that extra support here with snow load. A couple of years back when we had some heavy snow loads, I know a lot of folks that both commercial small farmers that had either high tunnels or greenhouses up that had 6 foot or more spacing, they had a lot of collapse occur. So the glazing material that I keep mentioning is like the skin or the transparent material that you have put on a greenhouse. It can be glass, it can be plastics, hard plastics, soft plastics. It's anything that's going to allow and diffuse light to the plants. And so when you're deciding on what kind of glazing material to use, know that there's going to be pros and cons to each type. Some things to think about when you're selecting that, things like the lifespan, the energy efficiency, the R value. R value is going to be its ability to insulate to keep the heat in. How easy is it to put up? How easy is it to replace? All of those things are going to be important. So things to think about, pros and cons. I have kind of just an overview of if you're planning on using, for example, glass, the pros, it's not going to yellow. It's going to allow the most light transmission. And you can potentially get it in single or double panes depending on what type of glass you're using. But it's also going to be potentially more expensive, possibly breakable. And it does create what's called sharp shadows in a greenhouse, which is not ideal. You want to have actual diffuse light if possible. So that's something to think about, but there's pros and cons to using something like glass. Fiberglass is another option for a glazing material. This is going to be cheaper than glass, can last a little bit longer. But some of the cons with using fiberglass is it usually yellows out pretty quick. And so you start to lose some of that light transmission for your plants over time. Seeing less of this used, but this is what fiberglass would look like. Polycarbonate has a long lifespan, can be UV protected to last long, and typically it's sold as a single polycarb or double or triple. For the high desert here, we don't really need the triple. Although we're cold, you're going to be amazed if you don't have a greenhouse yet at how warm it can stay there even in the cold winter temps. So usual recommendation for the high desert here would be to do double walled polycarb. Cost is about middle of the road as far as the different types of glazing materials. And this is what that looks like. 4 foot wide panels for easy installation. You can get larger ones, and usually they have a 10+ year lifespan. I know our greenhouse that we have at the demonstration garden We're right at year 10 for installation, and it still has pretty good light transmission. I'm just starting to see it change a little bit in the last year or two. We'll probably be able to get another few years out of it before we would want to replace it. Polyethylene is going to be plastic, and it's going to be your least expensive option. It has good light transmission, easy to install. One of the cons with using that is typically even the UV treated polyethylene. I mentioned that a little bit in the beginning with the high tunnel, and that's what you want to look for is the 6 mil plastic. And you want to make sure it's the greenhouse grade plastic. You don't want to use polyethylene that you buy, you know, at for example, the Home Depot that's for construction. It's not, you don't want the construction grade plastic. That's not going to last past a year for you. If you get the greenhouse grade plastic from a greenhouse supply company, then you'll probably get about 2 or 3 years out of it, and then you'll have to remove it and replace it. And yeah, it comes in different incremental widths, so you can use it accordingly. You can use it as a single layer, or in some cases, individuals can add a double layer where you're blowing air in between the top and bottom layer for the roof of it to provide some extra insulation for the heating inside. So I have this slide here that kind of goes through the pros and cons and important parts of selecting glazing materials. And again, you'll get this in the handout if you want to review this at some point. But these are some of the ones we just talked about. And just mentioning things like overall maintenance, the insulated value, how it allows light through, those types of things. I throw this in here just because it's a fun photo that I found on the internet of using recyclables to create a greenhouse. Looks like an interesting project. And again, this wouldn't be the most insulated greenhouse, but it's just a fun project and a way to reuse plastic bottles. So other things to think about with your design is the roof pitch. You want to make sure it's steep enough to allow shed to snow, to be able to shed snow and rain. You could even think about if, you know, the way you're designing your roof, whether or not it can collect some of the runoff, and you can maybe recycle the use of the runoff into watering your landscape, or somehow recirculating it back around in to the greenhouse. You may want to think about, again, if you're in an area where you get a lot more snow cover, then you may want to think about using some sort of metal structural support. Ideally, you want to make sure your foundation is square and there's not going to be too much of a slope. If you do have to have a slope because of the location and the topography, then just make sure it's less than a 5% slope, ideally, so that you don't have water pooling up in the greenhouse. That can create some management issues when the greenhouse is completed. You want to make sure you've got good drainage on your floor design. So whether you're using pavers, if you're using a solid floor like concrete, you want to have it draining to a certain area. Bricks or pavers can work. You can use gravel. In our greenhouse, we have a gravel floor that allows drainage. You just want to think about the materials you're using so that it's a little less slippery when it's wet. Here's an example of using pavers in a greenhouse. And here's another example of using pavers in a greenhouse. I'm just going to point out this hobby greenhouse that was used. They've got some nice design elements here as far as shelves and potting area. Some of the suggestions I would have in this type of greenhouse design is you can kind of get a sense from here that there's a lot of structural material used here that doesn't allow transmission of light. And so, you know, ideally it's a little less light than you would probably want in a greenhouse, but it probably works great for getting seeds started, maybe not year-round growing. And then also there's a lot of things being stored on the floors here, and you just want to make sure you're not getting weeds growing in there and that sort of thing, because that's where you can have a lot of overwintering insect pests. So it's a good idea always to keep it really neat and tidy, kind of a clean, tight space so that you're not encouraging the overwintering of insects and or disease. In an ideal world, you would have what's called an airlock on your entrance, meaning you kind of have a double door going into your greenhouse. And the value in putting in an airlock or like a little foyer would be that it prevents more pests from getting through to the actual plant material. So that's something to think about if you're building from scratch, where you kind of have a double entry into the greenhouse, where you'd have doors and then a little space. And that space could be a holding area. For example, if you're buying starts from a local nursery supply company, you could go in and put them in that holding area just to make sure there's no pests emerging before you introduce them into the actual greenhouse space. And so that's something to think about. When you're thinking about bench materials, you can build things from wood, you can put beams up on concrete blocks. If you're going to use metal, you can use a galvanized metal so that you don't have corrosion going on in the greenhouse, because remember, a greenhouse is going to have a kind of a wet, humid environment most of the time. Other things to think about with designing your benches, or if you're building them out, is just the reach, and make sure that anything usually wider than 3 feet are going to be hard to get into the center. You want to make sure it's at a comfortable height for your size, and you might want it to be a little taller or a little bit shorter. Here's an example of greenhouse at one of our research stations that we used to work in. You can see this one had this particular bench was wider than 3 feet, so it was often a little bit challenging to reach in and get to the center of that bed and push those flats around. So that's just something to think about depending on the size you're going to go with. And I just wanted to show you this. This is a larger size greenhouse than probably most of you would be using, but I wanted to show you, here's an example of where they're using a mix of glazing materials. So they have polycarbonate sidewalls and end walls for that permanent structure, but then the top of the greenhouse was a double layer of polyethylene. And so you would put one layer on and a second layer, and then you're running a fan and blowing heat through that to keep it insulated. And that's a pretty common practice for bigger greenhouse production, which may be more than what you need to do, but it's something you can consider using. When you're designing for benches in the greenhouse, you can think about design and layout, and there are ways to maximize the space within the greenhouse depending on if you turn your table sideways or if you're just running them along the sidewall here. But here are just some tips about different bench designs and what to think about as far as how wide to leave the aisles and that sort of thing, depending on if you're planning on bringing wheelbarrows into the greenhouse or if you're just going to be using it as a walking space. And if you really want to get fancy, you can use what's called rolling benches, because they will roll together and create additional space from within the greenhouse. If you really want to maximize the size of your greenhouse, you could do a rolling bench where the tabletop rolls and connects up to the next either sidewall or the next bench to maximize the space. And we talked a little bit more about table benches there. Kind of went over that already. So yeah, I just want to emphasize again the storage area. You can have a storage area underneath the benches, but make sure you kind of keep that night kind of tidy and make sure you keep it weed free. Here's just some examples of different floor plans and their percentage of bed to the entire area of the greenhouse. So whether if you're using benches, you may be directly planting into the ground. That's okay too. Just here's some different ideas on how to maximize the space. If you have electricity that you're going to have in the greenhouse, you just want to make sure you're have a watertight box that you're potentially using, just again, because you're going to have an increased amount of humidity and water in that greenhouse. If you are going to be maintaining the temperature in there and it's going to be regulating whether or not the heating and cooling is turning on and off through an automated system, then you want to potentially put a thermostat in. And if you put a thermostat in, general rule of thumb is to put that just about a foot above the top bed, whether it's in the ground or you have plants on benches. And that's going to kind of be the best area in order to give a reading for what the temperature is in the greenhouse setting. So ideally, all of these things that you're thinking about site selection, you're thinking about glazing materials, you're thinking about water resources, all electricity, if you're going to have that in there. All of this is about creating the end goal here is creating the ideal environment in which to grow plants. And so when you're thinking about design, those all play a critical role in whether or not the plants are going to be successfully grown in there, or your seeds are going to be successfully started. Because what the plant needs is water, light, the right air temperature, and carbon dioxide to be grown successfully. So water source, most people are going to probably be using a hose. Some may have an automatic irrigation system. If you're going to be putting a water line in that goes to your greenhouse, you just want to make sure it's insulated so that you don't have it breaking during the winter months. I just throw this in here for fun. Those of you in Central Oregon here can relate. This is what we use to put the water line in at the greenhouse we put in at our demonstration garden. And this machine was going through and trying to break ground, and I swear this machine was there for weeks on end. And you can see all the lava rock it had to get through so we could install a water line. As I mentioned earlier, you could collect roof runoff potentially. If you're starting plants from seeds or you're planning on doing propagation in your greenhouse, then a misting system might be nice. You can do an automatic irrigation misting system. You could use soaker hoses if you're doing in-ground beds in the greenhouse, drip irrigation for pots. There's a lot of different options with the irrigation. The misting systems are nice just because you're not going to have that really strong spray crushing your plants as they emerge from the seed and become a small seedling. When using pots in the greenhouse, you want something that's going to allow for good drainage. And so you want to allow the water to run out the holes on the bottom. And this is assuming that you're using soils. Some of you may be considering doing a hydroponic greenhouse. And of course, that's going to be a closed watering system where you're recirculating that water. I throw a little bit in here on hydroponics. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because it's a whole nother type of running a greenhouse. But the pros of hydroponics is it's a more efficient use of water if you're interested in that. And you're probably not battling weeds and that sort of thing. Initially, the cost is going to be much higher because there's a lot of equipment to get set up when you're putting on a hydroponic or aquaponic system. Here's an example of microtubes that can be used if you're trying to do more water efficiency, where each little tube goes into the individual pots. Sub-irrigation, this is a big commercial greenhouse, but I just wanted to show you we have a sub-irrigation mat, which means it's watering from the bottom up. And that's supposed to reduce water use by about 40%. So you're putting pots that are flat and have holes in them, and then it's a mat that gets wet and the plant will draw the moisture up as it needs it. If you're using a garden hose to water your plants in the greenhouse, that's going to be just fine. I would suggest getting what's called a misting nozzle, brands like Foggett, and you can see that's this top image here. It's just going to provide that nice mist for starting seeds in the greenhouse, and you're just screwing that on to the hose end sprayer. As the plants get bigger, you can jump up to what's called a soft stream water nozzle. This brand Dram creates some nice ones. They're called, like rain ones. And they're going to give you like a really soft spray so that you're not really flattening out your plants as you're watering them until they get bigger and stronger. If you're controlling water temperature, which most people don't worry too much about this, just as an FYI, this is the ideal temperature range for plants, and the ideal relative humidity, if you want to be measuring that in the greenhouse, is between 45 and 60%. So both inside the home, inside a greenhouse, and out in the landscape, one of the biggest causes of plant damage is overwatering, and it's no different in a greenhouse. We tend to see overwatering happening, and your plants will usually show signs of environmental stress if that's happening or occurring. So ideally you have good drainage if you're using soil-based plants and you're just allowing those plants to drain out and allow them to dry out between waterings for the most part. You don't want 100% dry out, but you do want to allow them to dry out and not consistently be wet. This is going to be important too in reducing the amount of plant disease and or certain insects such as fungus gnats, which love plants that are overwatered to thrive in a greenhouse environment. So you want to make sure you're not overwatering in the greenhouse. When you're starting seeds, you need to have that even, consistent moisture to get the seeds germinated. But after that, once the plants emerge, then you can start to spread out the amount of irrigation that's occurring. So air temperature is one of the biggest things in having a greenhouse environment. You have this environment where you're controlling those variables. And so I can't emphasize enough the importance of air temperature because it affects a plant's activities, including whether or not it can take up water and nutrients, whether or not it can photosynthesize, meaning it's producing its own food, cell division, all those things are affected by air temperature. So probably what we see more often here in the high desert is the sun comes out and the air temperature within the greenhouse, because of inadequate ventilation, it gets too hot in the greenhouse. And what you might see then is a slowdown in plant growth or stunted plant growth, or the plant's not producing or getting to where it's able to get pollinized, or it's not able to get fertilized and actually have harvesting yield because of the air temperature. So air temperature is critically important. And the range that you want to stay in a greenhouse, kind of that sweet spot, is 50 to 85 degrees. And you want to maintain that consistently day and night temperatures. It doesn't matter if it fluctuates a little bit up and down within that range, but once you get below 50 degrees and once you get above about 85 degrees in a greenhouse, then you're going to affect that plant's ability to do what it needs to do. And so keeping it from going above 85 is going to be the bigger challenge. We get cold here and it will go down below 50 as well during the winter months if you don't have supplemental heat or some sort of passive heating system. But really keeping it from going above 85 is more critical in my mind, and really where the challenge comes in for most. So making sure you've got adequate ventilation to allow for that cooling in the greenhouse. So one of the cheaper investments you can make is buying a Maxmin thermometer and just going out and recording. Once your greenhouse is set up, you go out and you record what that maximum temperature is doing each day. And so if you buy a Maxmin thermometer, it'll kind of show you from day to day what the high was and what the low was. And you want to try and regulate that if you're going above or below that range. I get asked a lot of interesting questions as it relates to growing in a greenhouse. And one of the questions I had once was related to growing apple trees. And so, you know, there are certain things that plants need to do physiologically to produce fruit. And for example, something like an apple tree, you would not be able to maintain in a greenhouse because they need that cold period in order to properly leaf out, blossom, and then produce fruit. So if you have it maintained in a greenhouse environment at 70 degrees consistently, you're not going to have the production that you want. You also want to be thinking about pollination and what plants need pollinated and whether or not to be growing those year round in a greenhouse. Because if you have to have insect pollination, are you going to have those insects in the greenhouse pollinating or not? Those are some things to think about. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here when it comes to heat loss. This is more of kind of the technical and science behind it, but I do have these slides included for you, and I've got some resources if you want to really talk about heat loss in the greenhouse. But these are the 4 factors that contribute to heat loss. And so when you're thinking about heat management, you want to reduce the amount of heat loss during the winter months, during the colder temps. But surprisingly, what I find in our greenhouse is on a sunny day, even if it's 30 something degrees outside, inside our greenhouse, it's usually 70 degrees. So that sun can do a lot of heating. And we have the 6 mil double wall polycarbonate, just to give you a sense of what we're using. There's actually a heat loss calculation you can do. I'm not going to go into this in detail for this presentation, but it's going to be available to you in this handout if you want to try to figure out the number of BTUs, which is the heating units needed to heat your greenhouse. If you're going to buy a heater, this would allow you to, this formula will help you select the size of the heating unit and what the BTUs or the output would be so that you would be able to heat it successfully and keep it above that 50-degree mark if you're planning to grow year round. So active heating systems would be, propane, natural gas. You can also do passive heating systems if you wanted to. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So just to give you an idea, an unheated greenhouse, the nighttime temp in the greenhouse is usually 8 to 10 degrees above the outside air temperature. For example, in a greenhouse, it's 8 foot by 12 foot or larger. For the smaller style kit greenhouses, like your 6 by 8 foot greenhouses, you usually have about 3 to 5 degrees warmer inside the greenhouse versus the outside air temperature at night. A passive heating system can be used, and I just use the walls of water here as kind of an example of what passive heating is. So for example, walls of water, we use these out in our gardens to grow tomatoes and peppers. The idea being that, the sunlight is hitting these water holding, well, in this case, the wall of water, but you could use 55-gallon drums. It will heat up during the day and then emit heat back at night. So if you want to use passive heating in a greenhouse, you could line the north-facing wall. And so that south-facing glazing material, the sun's coming in, hitting that back wall, heating those 55-gallon drums of water, heating it up during the day, and then emitting that heat back at night. I've seen rock storage used as well, in addition to water storage, where the back wall, the north-facing wall, or the north wall of the greenhouse is just all rocks. And again, the idea being that the rocks are getting heated up during the day with the sunlight and emitting heat back at night to keep that temperature higher during the nighttime. Here's an example. This is out of the University of Missouri. They have a passive solar greenhouse. For the passive solar greenhouse, you want to make sure that that angle, if you're building it on an angle, and I had that in an earlier slide. I don't think I mentioned it, but I based on where we are at geographically, the latitude we're at, I think the angle that you want to use to maximize winter sunlight, if you're going to do a passive solar greenhouse, is 68 degrees. Is the angle you want to use, so that when that sun's on its lowest horizon coming in, it'll hit, and you have the smallest angle of incidence, is what it's called, when it hits this wall. Again, and I already mentioned this, if you're going to do a solar greenhouse, you want no more than 125 to 150 square foot of glazing material on that south side to take full advantage of the sun. Oh, no, I have it here. Here it is, 54, not 68. So 54 degrees based on where our latitude is for that south wall angle if you're going to create your own or design your own greenhouse space. And here's an example of what a solar heated greenhouse might look like. So you would have that 54-degree angle wall. You would have water storage on that back wall as a heat collection system for that passive heating. And just some tips about water storage if you decide to go that route. Here's what that looks like. And here's a kind of the rule of thumb to use if you're planning on using passive water storage for heating. If you're going to use rock heat storage, here are some suggestions on what you need to use in order to do rock heat storage. I've only seen that used once here in Central Oregon. It's a little bit more high maintenance than the water storage. So lighting for plants, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. This is kind of a whole nother session in and of itself, but just if you're planning to do artificial lighting, you'll just want to know that vegetables like between 700 and 100 foot candles is the measurement used when we're talking about lighting. And so you can purchase for that. If you really want to get into the lighting and make sure you have sufficient lighting through your glazing material, you can use a light meter to see what the lighting is. And if you're going to get a light meter, you want to move it around the greenhouse in all spaces. You can buy the supplemental lighting from a lot of different resources, and different plants have different preferences for lighting needs. If you have low light, you're going to end up having plants that are leggy, kind of stretched, and maybe are bending towards the light where there's most sufficient light. What you can try and do to avoid that is if, as your plants start to grow, you notice them doing this, having this phototrophic growth. What we see here with the stretching or bending is just to be rotating that. Even if you're starting seeds on a windowsill in your house, you just want to make sure you're turning the pots so that you avoid that, so that you end up with the strongest growth in stem. If you build a greenhouse and it's so tightly sealed, it's possible, depending on how you're growing and the number of plants you're growing, that you can deplete the supply of carbon dioxide, which again is going to affect that slow plant growth. So it helps to have circulating fans in your greenhouse, so you're moving that air around. And in some situations, you can actually buy carbon dioxide enhancement systems, but most backyard growers that's going to be excessive. Just get some circulating fans to help move that air around. Ideally, for summer management, keeping the heat out, you're going to want to use an adequate ventilation system, meaning something that's actually opening and allowing the hot air to escape. Don't depend on circulating fans, and don't depend on shade cloth alone to be adequate ventilation. It's not going to be successful for you here in the high desert. General rule of thumb is that you have at least sidewall ventilation. The ideal type of ventilation is going to be roof ventilation. And the total size of all the vents should total 20 to 25% of the floor space or glazing material to keep the environment at a good temp. So for example, if you had a 10-foot by 10-foot size greenhouse and it was 100 square feet of floor, of floor space, you would want to have 25 square feet of ventilation. So 25 square feet with the roof vents or the side vents or the walls all in total to allow adequate ventilation. You can buy solar vents. There's like marine solar vents that can be popped into a greenhouse roof. If your system or your kit that you buy doesn't come with roof ventilation, there are ways to add that in. If you want to do passive ventilation, you want to make sure that you have high vents and low vents, and that ideally, again, that roof ventilation would be best. And you can see some examples here of how to put in natural ventilation, or make sure you're placing them in the right spots. And then usually the low vents are going to be on the windward side where the wind comes through. And then on the leeward side, you would have potentially higher ventilation systems, even all the way up here at the top. You can see in this one, they have pretty excessive ventilation that's going to be sufficient in cooling that space. Shade cloth comes in different shapes and sizes, and it blocks anywhere from 25% of the light all the way up to 75% of the light. Shade cloth is going to help cool a greenhouse down to some degree, but you don't want to depend on shade cloth alone, because it's not going to work effectively to sufficiently cool. And you want to be careful with shade cloth that you're not filtering out too much light, or you're going to end up with leggy plants that aren't growing as well as they should be. There's not really a lot of crops I can think of that prefer to be grown under shade cloth. Some of the cool season crops like lettuce can handle it, but most of our sun-loving plants prefer to have full sunlight. So here's an example of shade cloth. You just want to make sure you've got tie downs, and perhaps you're putting it on just certain times a year during the hotter months, just to keep it a little bit cooler inside. Successful seed germination in the greenhouse depends on soil temperatures if you're growing in soil, moisture, and sometimes light. But really, you don't need light's not a critical factor in getting seeds to germinate. It's not until they've actually germinated and start to put on growth that they need the light. So really, it's soil temperature and moisture. So you want consistent soil temperatures and even consistent moisture to get those seeds to germinate. And we've got information in our vegetable garden guide on how to know what soil temperatures are ideal for certain seeds to get going. And we can put that link in our chat here on growing vegetables so you know how to start seeds and what the ideal soil temperature is. You can buy heating mats to put under your flats or trays if you're going to be using those in the greenhouse, and that'll help keep an even soil temperature to get your seeds to germinate quickly. This is the soil temperature range for most seeds, and some can start at cooler, get germinated more quickly at cooler temps, and some need higher temps in order to germinate well. Also, if you're using a seeding mix, you're going to have better success than if you're using a heavier type of soil amendment or actual soil that's going to hold too much moisture. So a seeding mix allows for good draining, good drainage, and so that's going to allow you to be more successful in getting your seeds started. These are some of the more common seeds you may start in a greenhouse. To get them going here, that might be helpful in the Central Oregon area, just so that by the time we get into our real spring/summer, this year we're charted for that to be, May or June here. It's helpful to get some of these things started in a greenhouse. Most commonly what's grown in a greenhouse are going to be these ones, like tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, sometimes herbs, microgreens, those things. And you also want to be thinking about, depending on what you're starting, you want to be thinking about pollination and what works for plants that need pollination. With your greenhouse, if you're not maintaining that kind of that ideal range that I mentioned, 55 to 85, once you get above 90 in a greenhouse, you're not going to have, even if you're opening your indoor to let pollinators in and do work for plants that need insect pollination, if it's above 90 degrees and it's hot in the greenhouse, insects aren't going to go into that environment. And so it's going to affect that plant and whether or not it gets pollinated. So again, that's another reason to be maintaining that ideal temperature range in the greenhouse if you have plants that need pollinated. So here's just some examples of plants that may or may not need pollination. For example, tomatoes are wind pollinated. But if you're growing them in the greenhouse, because you may not have that strong environment of airflow or movement, you're going to have to potentially help with the pollination. There are certain seeds that are sold that can be used in a greenhouse that don't require pollination that normally would in an outside environment. So you can look for those in seed catalogs. They'll actually say greenhouse seed types. For example, cucumbers can be sold that way and other plants. So I have a couple of different seed catalogs, a list here where you can look for greenhouse seeds that are actually specifically hybridized for greenhouse use. Some of those seeds may have been hybridized for certain disease resistance that's more common in a greenhouse to prevent bolting, that sort of thing, and to make sure that pollination isn't required to get to production on the plant. Here are a few of the companies: Stokes, Johnny's Selected Seeds, Territorial, where you can look for certain types of seeds that are ideal for growing in a greenhouse environment. Here's some examples of different trays that are used. You can use, when you're starting out and you're germinating seed, you want to be using a pretty shallow flat. You don't want to use real deep pots because it's going to be too much moisture held to the seed, and you may end up with rotting seeds versus seeds that are able to germinate. I wouldn't go any deeper than a 4-inch, either individual pot or a 4-inch flat. The one here on the right are just typical starting flats. There's a lot of different options and choices you can be using here to get seed started. But this is just showing you your classic seeding flat. And again, this would have drainage on the bottom and allow moisture through, so it's not holding too much moisture. If you're in a greenhouse environment, you don't necessarily need to be covering it. Hopefully there will be enough humidity, but you could try that. You just want to make sure your plants or your seeds aren't getting overheated if you have a cover on these types of trays. These are deeper cells, and these are kind of an all-in-one cell. It's a 4-inch pot. It encourages the plants to come up, and then you'll get a pretty good root system. And usually something like this, once the seeds come up on the right here, these seeding flats, something like this, you're going to get the seeds up and going, and then you're going to want to transplant them either into bigger pots so they get a more extensive root system, or potentially you could be planting them out if you've timed it correctly and it's safe to put them outside. Something here like this on the left, usually this is an all-in-one. You're getting the seeds to germinate, and then you'll get a more extensive root system. And by the time the plants are up and out, like what you're seeing back here, they can be popped right out and into the soil or the vegetable garden outside, or a bigger pot if need be. So you just want to make sure your seedlings don't dry out, and you don't really want to disturb them or take them out of this site and into this site until you get what's called true leaves. So the first couple of leaves that come up on plants are called cotyledons. And then after the cotyledons are up, you get what's called the true leaves, which are going to be the 3rd and 4th and so on leaves from there. Once you get several true leaves on your seedling, then you can go ahead and try and take it out and transplant it into either a bigger pot size or directly into the ground outside. You want to make sure if you're going from a greenhouse environment where you started your seeds to acclimating your plants, and remember that greenhouse environment is going to have higher humidity than the outside humidity. And so you want to take them maybe from the inside to the outside gradually so they don't go into transplant shock. And usually what that means is you are taking the plants outside in the morning sunlight. The sunlight is going to be a little bit different too, because that glazing material is going to diffuse some of that light. And so it won't be quite as harsh or direct as the outside light transmission. And so you want to make sure you're gradually pulling those plants in and out over a couple of weeks span of time, so that you're going from the inside environment to the outside environment. I use an example of a rhododendron here. These were plants that were grown in a greenhouse environment, and then they were donated to us during the winter months here. And at that time we didn't have a greenhouse, so I had to put the plants that were given to me just outside in February, and almost immediately they experienced transplant shock. By the next day, all of the fleshy new growth had kind of wilted like this, just because of full exposure to a low humidity environment and a higher elevation, stronger sunlight for plants that were originally grown over in the valley. So acclimation of your seedlings from a greenhouse to outside is going to be important, where you're gradually introducing the plant outside to the sun, light environment, and then you just kind of add more time each day until the plants can be successfully put out for good. Okay, now I'm just going to highlight some of the most common greenhouse pests. And from the poll that you mentioned, looked like aphids were some of the bigger challenges individuals were having. I don't know if folks were answering for both greenhouse pests and or outside pests, but that would be true here. Aphids are one of our toughest outdoor pests as well. But these are probably the top 5 pests that you see in a greenhouse. And managing greenhouse pests can be a really big challenge, because you've created an ideal growing environment, right? That's the goal, create this ideal growing environment where you have great humidity, efficient moisture, and there's not really necessarily, in some ways, if you start with greenhouse pests inside, they don't have their natural predators necessarily getting into that greenhouse to take care of that pest problem and manage that population. So what can you do about it? I'm going to go over management for these pests in a little bit here. I wanted to make sure I had enough time to cover some other things, so we'll go back to management here in a bit and just for imaging here. This is a whitefly, and down here is what's called thrips. And both of those can cause pretty significant damage on greenhouse plants. So when you're managing for pests, you're going to be doing integrated pest management techniques, and that's using all types of management, from cultural control to biological control to potentially chemical control, whether it be organic or synthetic if you need to. Monitoring is a part of integrated pest management, and that's where potentially you're sticking a sticky trap up in your greenhouse. You can just buy these from a local garden center or online, and this is going to be used for monitoring, and it will actually catch some of the pests as well, but it's just to give you an idea of how many pests are actually present. And certain pests are attracted to certain colors, for example, the yellow cards or blue cards in the case of thrips. But the idea is that you're monitoring to see if there's actually a really big pest population and if it's going up. So you're using these sticky traps to see how many are showing up each day, and you're kind of recording that or writing it down or mentally recording that. Is this trap getting filled up really quickly? If you notice a pest problem in the greenhouse, my recommendation would be to isolate those plants immediately. Take them out. Sometimes it's a good idea if you have it, you know that you have a pest problem in your greenhouse and you just can't seem to get rid of it. Sometimes the best way to get rid of it is actually to clear the entire greenhouse and let it sit for a while so that there's no host plant material for the pests to thrive and live on. And so sometimes it requires like just cleaning it out and letting it sit in an unheated in a cold winter month, just to kind of kill any existing pests and make sure there's no food source so that they kind of move on and they move out. If your greenhouse, you're growing directly in the ground, you may need to think about crop rotation because insects and plant disease can build up and they're very host specific. So you may want to rotate crops. So even if you have a certain pest population in the soil, or you have a disease pathogen in the soil, because those things are host specific, if you rotate through different plant families, you can avoid infecting or having those plants be kind of reduce that insect or plant disease population if there's not the right host plant for it to thrive on. So always, one of the things I'm always doing for when we do have plants in our greenhouse is we want to make sure that we're removing dead or diseased plant material. I'm always inspecting the underside of leaves for insect pests. If I suspect any sort of plant disease, I know that in a greenhouse environment, insects and plant disease can take off really quickly because it's that ideal growing environment, and it creates that ideal environment for those types of pests to thrive. So I'm going to get rid of those plants quickly. You can consider buying disease-resistant varieties in the seeds that you select. Okay, this was my last slide if we were out of time, but we still got a little bit of time here. So I'm going to just move through pest management quickly, and then I will take questions. So for aphid management, one of the things that you can do is you can buy a screening material that would go over your open ventilation. So if you have roof vents, or even you could put a screen door on the door if your door to your greenhouse is going to provide some of the ventilation that's required to keep it cool. What you can do is get a screen door and you can put this screening material that doesn't allow aphids to come through it. It's fine enough that it doesn't allow aphids to come through it. Or you can place this over a ventilation system vents if you need to. It's the weave is pretty small on this, so the idea is that it doesn't allow some of these smaller pests to fly in the greenhouse at all. It does reduce the airflow, so that's something to think about if you think you're going to use screening material over your ventilation system to keep the smaller insect pests out. Then you might want to increase the amount of ventilation because you will have reduction in the true ventilation with the screening material. And you can get this at greenhouse supply companies. Other things to think about, you can introduce some of the biological types of pest management into your greenhouse where you release, and some of these work really well because the environment, for example, if you're going to release ladybird beetles or something like that, you can do that. And what's nice in the greenhouse environment is because it's enclosed, they will stay in place. You know, in an outside environment, they can take off and fly away. If you've got a food source for them, for example, aphids, and you release them in there, then they'll probably stick around, feed, and try and control that pest problem. There are organic sprays that you can use. And again, you just want to make sure that you're reading the label and you're buying something that's safe for a food crop if you're growing edible food crops. Whitefly is a really tough one. What's hard about whitefly is what works for one part of the life cycle, for example, the egg or the larvae, doesn't work for the adult part of the life cycle. And because they fly around upon disturbance, it can be really tough to get rid of them. But here are some examples of what the damage looks like from whitefly. It usually causes stippling damage in the leaf, where eventually the leaf gets lighter and lighter. And there are some different ways to manage for whitefly. You can use, one of the biggest things with whitefly is making sure you don't have weeds growing in your greenhouse, because they will often be found on the underside of leaves, especially on weeds if you let the weeds go. So checking the underside of all the leaves of the plants will help with whitefly management. So you're just monitoring for that, removing any of those overwintering or places where they have habitat. You can introduce some biological control with parasitic wasps or predatory mites can work well against whitefly management. And there is a beneficial fungus that will also manage for whitefly. Again, you can use something like neem oil or azadirachtin that can be used, or insecticidal soap, depending on what you're growing. Here's what damage looks like from thrips. Thrips are really, really tiny. We've got a lot of thrips in our outdoor environments here. Pretty hard to see, but again, these are some of the more difficult pests to get rid of in a greenhouse. Sometimes you just have to remove plant material and start over with thrips. Different types of thrips management, again, controlling those weeds. Sometimes they overwinter in the gravel if you've got a gravel floor. You can use predatory mites again, minute pirate bugs, and that beneficial fungus as well can be used and applied to help with thrips management. Here are some other additional types of organic pesticides that can be used. And then mite damage, again, mites reproduce really quickly. They cause that what's called stippling damage, where they suck the chlorophyll out of the cells of the leaf and cause the plant to fail. The challenge with mites in particular is they've built up a lot of resistance over time through pesticide use, so they're a little bit tough to get rid of, but there are predatory mites that can be introduced in a greenhouse environment. And here are some of the other types of pesticides that can be used. And last but not least are fungus gnats. So those are the top 5 that we typically have a challenge with. Fungus gnats are usually, they're going to show up when you're overwatering. So if that soil is being held too wet from day to day, then they're going to thrive. And it's usually the larval stage here on the lower left is what you see that's going to be feeding on the root system of the plant. But you'll see evidence of the fungus gnats by the adults flying around upon disturbance. Those are those little tiny black flies you'll see around your houseplants sometimes too, if there's too much moisture. One of the easiest ways to get rid of fungus gnats is just to reduce the excessive moisture and scale back on the watering. And here are some other biological controls you can use in the chemical controls. There are some plant diseases that show up in greenhouses like downy mildew. Sometimes even the powdery mildews will show up. And we've got some suggestions on how to manage for those in our Pacific Northwest handbook on plant disease. So you can look that up there. Sometimes you'll see something like leaf mold too. And if you have some of these going on, this is going to be a matter of poor air circulation. So just improving air circulation can help decrease the amount of plant disease. Okay, I think what I'm going to do now, just kind of skip over. Oh, we got something on weed control. I was going to show you, here's an example of what weed control you can do in a greenhouse. This is our greenhouse. We've got gravel as our floor, basically to allow water to drain through. But then we went And underneath the actual benches, we put down a weed barrier or the polywoven, which is, it looks like a fine weave when you look at it up close type of weed barrier, just to keep weeds from coming up under the benches. So we didn't have to crawl on our hands and knees and get under there and pull weeds. It's working pretty well for us. So for weed control in your greenhouse, just hand pulling, just making sure you keep it out, especially so that you don't end up with the white fly or thrips population hanging out on your weeds. Okay, here's another look at our greenhouse, and this was before we have weed barrier now underneath this bench. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and take questions now. Let's see. Okay, so first question here. I have a 16 by 20 foot greenhouse that does not currently have electrical winter heating. I've been making small cloches in the raised beds and have had a great deal of success. I have done this to avoid the costs associated with running an electric heater during the winter, as space heaters really use the electricity. Have you used this technique, or do you have any thoughts on these? Yeah, I mean, if it's working for you to use cloches within the greenhouse, I think that's a great way to try and get things going earlier. So yeah, that's a good suggestion for those to try and keep the heat in those different areas. And again, if you have sufficient glazing, that should work well for you. You just want to make sure you're monitoring the maximum temperature in there so that you're not overheating. Because what I've seen, okay. So yeah, just to make sure you're not getting too hot in there, because that'll slow down the plant growth. You noted water drums may freeze. Will this burst them? Well, good question. If you're using a 55-gallon drum that's heavy duty, then you shouldn't see it bursting. I wouldn't use a thin material, so I'd be using either metal or a thick plastic, and then you're probably just allowing for that expansion to occur in case it does freeze in there. So don't fill it all the way up. Leave some room there for that expansion to occur. Okay. Hi, just to put it out there, some plants are light dependent terminators like geranium. Thanks so much for this wonderful lecture. Yeah, so depending on what you're growing, that's going to be what you want to think about when you're introducing light. So the challenge for individuals is going to be if you're doing a lot of different types of plants and the lighting requirements are different. So for example, some plants require a certain length of or period of darkness in order to produce the flowers. And if you have a mixture of plants in there where this plant needs more light or longer light hours and doesn't require as much darkness, or that's going to affect probably what you're going to grow. And some of the challenges I've had people experience is when they're doing a mix of plant types, because they're using it more like an indoor environment to, they have chairs and seating environment. They're trying to figure out how to balance those needs. So that's something to think about. Well, how do you want to use the greenhouse? What do you want to grow in the greenhouse? Because that may affect what type of lighting you have in that greenhouse and what you can do. Oh, and then, okay, germinators rather, yeah. Yeah, there's a handful of plants where you actually need light to germinate the seed, but the majority of seeds that people are going to grow, especially your vegetable crops, don't require light for germination. But you should see that on a seed packet. If it requires light for germination, the seed packet should tell you that. And so you know that you're going to need light for germination. Otherwise, really the main variables you'll need for germination would be soil temperature and moisture. Are there soil recommendations for greenhouse raised planters? Are horse manure or coffee grounds okay? Other suggestions? Okay. Soil recommendation for greenhouse raised planters. So when you're saying a raised planter, I'm going to make an assumption here. You're meaning like structurally it's enclosed, so it's built with like either a wood frame or concrete blocks or mason blocks or something. And if you have a raised planter, that should be treated like a container, just like a flower pot. And so you're going to want to fill that not with native soils or anything heavy like that. You're going to want to fill it with soil amendment that allows for good drainage. So use an actual raised bed mix. You can get those either pre-formulated in bags. I've seen those at some of the local supply companies here, the local nurseries, and I've seen it at places like Wilco where it's actually called raised garden bed mix. So that's going to allow for sufficient drainage. And if your horse manure, as long as it's aged and not hot, so you've allowed it to sit for 6 months or longer so that it's not going to be too hot in nitrogen, you can add that in. And you may get some weed seeds in there potentially or not, and you want to make sure the manure is clean from herbicide residue. So sometimes we're seeing with manures, because of the pasture that was sprayed for weeds, you can have that herbicide pass through the animals and actually still reside in the manure, and that can affect the growth of plants, especially vegetable garden plants. Can be really sensitive to that. So just as long as your horse manure, is clean and the source of where it came from, then yes, you can use that mixed in with something that's going to keep that raised bed soil planter lighter. So traditionally, the recommendation would have been peat moss, but peat moss, as we know, is not necessarily a sustainable resource. And so there's a transition going on where the recommendation would now be coconut coir, COIR, to help lighten up that soil and make sure you've got sufficient drainage in that raised bed. Coffee grounds are fine. The research on coffee grounds is pretty interesting. If you go back and you actually look at the research on how coffee grounds affects the pH of a soil, it takes a tremendous amount of coffee grounds to actually lower pH in soil. And there are only certain plants that respond well to that. So it does not hurt to add coffee grounds. So there's no disadvantage that I'm aware of to throwing coffee grounds in if you want to, but the actual benefit is pretty minimal. And it was kind of interesting to do some digging in on that because of that perception out there that coffee grounds are going to dramatically change pH. It really doesn't work that way in a larger growing system. Okay, my aunt in England cleans her greenhouses annually with bleach. Thoughts? Yes, so I can tell you that like that isn't necessarily a bad idea if you're going to allow it to air out and that sort of thing. Usually, I don't know that bleaching the entire greenhouse is necessary unless you have known plant disease on your benches or something you want to try and sanitize for that. Usually just cleaning out the greenhouse, picking things up off the floor so there's no hiding places for insects and to hang out or habitate. And one of the things though that we do for ours is we will use a bleach solution, a 10% bleach solution for any of the pots or trays or anything that we're using in there. So in case there was plant disease present, in between use, we'll just do a dip, and you're just dipping those pots or you're dipping those trays in a bleach solution, and you're going to kill any plant disease pathogens that could be present on those pots. So I don't know that you necessarily need to go in and do a heavy bleaching unless you're going to do that and then just stay out of it for a while, just because probably isn't something you want to be in until it's kind of dissipated. But you could use that for any of the tools or planting containers that you're using. And that is a common practice in bigger greenhouses as well. Okay, let's see. Along the lines of using coffee grounds, thoughts on use of eggshells in the soil. Again, you can add eggshells in the soil. You're better off to put the eggshells in a compost pile and have it be composted and use the compost rather than the direct eggshells in the soil. Again, some of the byproduct of the eggshells really isn't going to be beneficial, and it usually is it's going to help to increase the pH of our native soil. So if you're growing in a greenhouse, you're usually using a pre-formulated mix that you're growing in, and there's really not a need to add eggshells to something like that. And then in our native soils, we really don't have a need for eggshells. It provides, some of the calcium and that sort of thing, but only if you're having an issue would I say you could consider that, but I don't think it's something I would recommend unless you're just trying to find a way to, recycle the eggshells. Any other questions I can answer? So again, you'll get the copy of this handout. I'm available as a resource if you've got questions as you go. And I'm also, in addition to the handout, I also have what's called just a greenhouse resource list. And on that resource list, I have a little bit of everything. I have a list of research-based publications on engineering greenhouses, greenhouse design. I have list of online classes. I have a list of websites that are available to you. I have a list of greenhouse supply companies in our region that I know of. And so just some other resources for you on things you can be looking for. Let's see, I have raised beds in my greenhouse and a terrible thrips problem year after year. Is there anything I can do to get rid of them? Yeah, so some of those suggestions that I have, let's see, raised beds. So it looks like, so it's a permanent raised bed probably. You may want to think about removing the top level of soil so that if they're overwintering in that soil, you can be starting out fresh. So if you haven't tried that yet, that might be something to do, is kind of replace the soil in those beds to get rid of that thrips and keep it clean for a while. So take that soil out, or soil amendment, whatever you're using in that raised bed, take it out and let it sit for a little bit and just allow it to go dormant, so that potentially you clean out that population. If they don't have a food source, think about pests. They need a food source to continue the life cycle. So if they don't have a food source for a while, then they'll clear out eventually. Okay, any other, just a lot of thank yous. You're welcome. Again, let me know if you've got additional questions. Okay, I don't see any other questions.
Okay,
So I'll hand it back over to Vicki.
thank you. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. So everyone, first of all, thank you so much for coming out again on this wonderful April Earth Day. Thank you for participating. And at the end, when we stop the webinar, you'll get a prompt for a survey, and we would really like for you to please complete that, because that helps us improve our webinars and how we are offering our community gardening sessions. So thank you again, and the recording will be available in a few days, and you should get an email on that. And if you don't get it in your inbox, just double check your spam folder to make sure that it didn't go there. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and Amy, Joe, and Rocky, thank you so much for helping very much. And thank you, everyone. So I think that's it. We're going to call it an Earth Day. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.